we retaliate against what the United States will do, even at the cost of a total war between China and the United States in terms of tariff war or trade war or otherwise.
A trade war between two of the world's biggest economies seemed unthinkable a few months ago, but that's where we seem to be this morning. President Trump has threatened an extra 50% tariff, which, if imposed, could leave some US companies bringing in certain goods from China facing a 104% tax. Carrie Locke is the former US ambassador to China and told us earlier there are a few winners in a global trade war.
The other country is going to retaliate, as we've seen from China and Canada and many other countries. They're going to retaliate, which means that the price of American goods being sold in those countries will go up, which means fewer people and companies will buy those American products. And if there's lower sales of American products, that means you don't need as many workers. And that means higher unemployment. All around, people are going to lose.
That was Gary Locke, the former US ambassador to China. Well, let's get the view from China now with Victor Gao, who's the vice president of the Centre for China and Globalisation. Good morning.
Good morning.
The biggest question for everybody this morning, given the escalation, is what will China do now?
I think the Chinese government has announced that it will launch a mirror image of the tariff against China. And this is very proportional, very measured. It is completely in retaliation against the wrongful sanction tariffs launched by the United States against China. Now, President Trump threatened to further increase 50% of tariff against China, and he demanded China to rescind the announced retaliation. I would say two things. One is that Chinese government will definitely retaliate again if the United States imposes additional 50% tariff against Chinese export. China will announce immediately 50% retaliatory tariff against the US export to China. Now, the second point, which is equally, if not even more important, is that in this round of trade war initiated by the United States, not only against China, but against so many countries in the world, China will not blink first. China will not be the first country to blink vis-a-vis the United States. In China, we have no panic buying of things made in the United States, for example, whereas in the United States, people are panicking. They are buying things from the supermarkets, from the department stores, made in China, made in other countries. Therefore, I hope President Trump and his advisors, some of whom are really very much flawed in terms of character and decency, for example, should realize that tariff will not save the United States. Tariff war against other countries is the wrong thing. Of course, different countries will decide what they need to do in front of such maximum pressure from the United States, but China's view is very clear. Stand up firm and do a tit-for-tat retaliation against the United States. And I hope by the end of the day, President Trump will realize how wrong he has been in using such maximum pressure against China.
And if Donald Trump doesn't realise, as you say, that he's wrong and he doesn't go back on his tariff decisions, which all indications are at the moment that he won't, is there any way to avoid a global recession as a result?
No, I think from the Chinese perspective, we'll never go to Washington and beg for something. China's position will be very clearly defined. Do whatever the United States is doing to China, and we retaliate against what the United States will do, even at the cost of a total war between China and the United States in terms of tariff war or trade war or otherwise. This is the firm decision of China. China will never cry uncle or go to Washington with its hat in its hand and beg for something. This is not the way China is doing. China is defending its fundamental interest in the right way, and the people in China support it. And I think eventually it will never be China who will blink first. Remember what I say, and let's wait for another day or another week or less than 4 years to come and to see what will happen.
And you're saying that China can sustain through that amount of time. I'm interested there. You said no matter what happens, an economic war, a trade war, or anything else. What do you mean when you refer to any other kind of war? What do you mean by that?
because the wars launched by the United States against China are already multiple wars. You are talking about the tariff war, the trade war, the technology war, the talent war, the energy war, and the threatened military war of different kinds, including proxy war, etc. I think China is fully prepared to deal with the United States as it is, as friend if they want to be, as a foe if they want to be, in any way, peace or otherwise. And I think this is the message China wants to give to Washington. Why? Because in matters of such importance to global peace and stability.
But can we be very clear here? Can we be very clear here? Are we talking, Victor Gao, about Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan is part of China. Every government in the world recognize that. No one should be diverted by the issue of Taiwan. Taiwan's reunification is the megathreat. It will happen during the lifetime of most of us watching your show.
Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Centre for China and Globalisation, many thanks for your time on the programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
And of course, in reality, lots of countries around the world do not accept that Taiwan is part of China. Richard Spencer is the Times China correspondent and he joins us on the line. You've been listening to that. Richard, what did you make of that from Victor Gao?
Yeah, I think the Chinese have been preparing for this, probably been preparing for this more than Wall Street, by judging by the reactions on both sides. And they think they have a plan. Now, how much that plan will work, nobody really can be sure. But they've been diversifying their export markets. The proportion of their exports that go to America is already declining. They think they can ride this out. They do have this one big advantage, as I've written a couple of times, which is, if Britain or America takes a hit of a couple of percentage points of GDP, we all go into a complete, collapse and political crisis and everything. For China, it's been growing so fast in recent years that if it could lose 10% of its GDP and just be back where it was 5 years ago. And most people in China sort of remember that, and they don't like what's happening. They don't like the current state of the Chinese economy, let alone what's coming next. But they, they know they're better off than they were 10, 20 years ago, and then they can soak up a bit of pain.
So they are realistically, in your view, in a better position economically to deal with this over the long term, as Victor Gao was suggesting there, than the US would be?
Well, they have a plan. I mean, the problem with America, as far as I can see, I mean, I'm not an American expert, they don't seem to have a plan. Wall Street clearly wasn't expecting this. Even Trump's advisors don't seem to be expecting this. Are you going to invest in America at the moment? That's the aim, is to get reinvestment into America. Whereas, you haven't been investing in China recently. There's been a decline in investment in China recently because Xi Jinping has introduced his own policy uncertainty in the last few years by the way he's been managing the Chinese economy. But they are now going to be actively seeking out investment from abroad and actively seeking out new markets. And they've been developing new markets in Africa and in Southeast Asia, as we know. And that's what they're looking for. American firms have not been doing that, and in some ways it doesn't matter because although they're mostly targeting China, they're also targeting other countries as well. Now is not the time to be opening a factory in Vietnam or Taiwan or anywhere else if you're an American investor.
What do you make of the Taiwan question? Because, I mean, Victor Gao, though, was very clearly opening up the question of sovereignty, and we know what China's view is on this. Do you think that does make that question more live?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it certainly makes the question more live. I think the general feeling over the last couple of years is that the threat of war over Taiwan has receded. President Biden made a very calculated and in defiance of what we think about President Biden now, a very clear policy around Taiwan and around American presence in East Asia. Now, the question really is whether Donald Trump is going to challenge that as well as everything else, whether he's going to say, well, we will not defend Taiwan, we don't care about East Asia, America first and all that. I mean, there's a split in the Trump advisors about that, about whether he he is going to sort of abandon Taiwan like he has kind of tried to abandon Ukraine. But the impression we've had recently, Pete Hegseth, his defense secretary, came out to Japan and said, no, we will defend Taiwan. We've got to deter China over Taiwan. And that introduced sort of clarity. And I do think that Xi Jinping is not thinking about upping the ante over Taiwan when all the rest of this is going on. I mean, that could be suicidal for China if at a time when everyone's kind of in China's boat now, we're all on China's side in this trade war with America, effectively, if he starts alienating the people who sort of now see China as a more stable option than America, if you like.
Yeah.
I think that goes further away, but obviously in the long run, the unpredictability of the situation does mean everything's up in the air.
Richard, finally, that point there you just made at the end about we're all on China's side now, which is not a phrase I thought any of us would be uttering over the last couple of weeks. But does it mean that it's easier for Labour to make the argument, which, to be fair, they had already started to make, and we know that there have been a number of different visits already, that the UK needs to try and work more closely with China economically? Does that make that argument easier now for the UK government?
I think it makes it easier for them. It's certainly making it easier in Europe. I mean, that's already been raised quite openly by some, particularly the southern European nations who are less hawkish on China generally. I think one thing we'll have to look at. I mean, I've talked about this before, but electric cars are kind of a touchstone for the world economy now. Do we want lots of cheap Chinese electric cars, to help us meet our net zero targets and bring down prices of cars in Britain? Or are we going to try and keep them out? Because those electric car markets that are being shut off by America, and the EU has also imposed tariffs on Chinese electric cars. China is now looking for other markets to sell those electric cars into, and we do not have tariffs on Chinese electric cars at the moment. So are we going to say, oh God, we don't want our shops and our markets to be flooded with cheap Chinese exports that can't go to America now, or are we going to somehow put up our drawbridge as well to protect our own industry, our own car industry? That's a big question for the Labour government, actually.
Richard, many thanks. That is Richard Spencer there, the Times China correspondent.
The idea of Trump driving the whole world to China is a really striking one, and one which becomes deeply plausible. The other thing I took from Victor Gao is that China doesn't care about elections. It doesn't really care about the sanctity of human life. It doesn't really care about the specific interests of its middle classes in the same way as America. So in a game of chicken, Xi Jinping is much better equipped than Donald Trump because he doesn't have to care about unpopularity. He doesn't have to care about the economic consequences in the same way. So if you want to, you could make the case this could be the best thing that ever happens to China, because they fight America on this, and they're the last country standing out of the two of them.
There's also some really interesting reporting today in the Times about the fact that Donald Trump is being driven by his personal sort of hatred of China. He feels that COVID was China's fault and it prevented him from his political aims at that moment in time. And therefore, this is almost his personal feelings about China are clouding his economic judgments here in this particular moment. And that's why he won't back down either.
Mara says also the UK press underreports one of the main reasons Trump wants tariffs. He wants the money to pay off the deficit so he can lower taxes. He thinks this will be the solution to the economic hit of tariffs. Low taxes will make the US whole again. It's important to understand this because he will not listen to experts because of it, and he won't change his mind. That last point is entirely well made, Mara, I think.
Yeah, I think we've covered the fact that it's a domestic agenda, but ultimately this will likely push up inflation in America, which will not help serve that aim, which might make it much more difficult politically. But it's an interesting question.